So we've seen how the giants of the Middle Ages cast long shadows influencing later thought. But how exactly did their ideas survive? How did those intricate arguments and profound insights make it from a medieval scholar's mind, through centuries of copying, printing, and translation, to land on our desks today? It's rarely a straight line, as we'll see. Let's kick things off with a real-world example that perfectly illustrates the pitfalls. Imagine this beautiful set of 16 volumes, Duns Scotus Opera Omnia. Sounds comprehensive, right? Like you've got the whole man in your library. Tempting, isn't it? Well, hold your horses. This set is a bit of a mixed bag. Some stuff inside, not even Scotus's work, just got wrongly attributed back in the day. And guess what? Some of his actual important works, like his early Lectura, are missing. Plus, they label something as Book 1 of the Reportatio, but it's actually a different, disputed text altogether. So already we're facing attribution issues. Then, there's the edition itself, a photographic reprint of the 1639 Wadding edition. Think about that, 1639. That's not exactly cutting-edge textual scholarship. The Wadding editor didn't sit down with all the manuscripts, meticulously comparing them using modern principles. No, he often just grabbed the first couple of manuscripts he could find and copied them. Sometimes, he didn't even check if the resulting text made any sense. And here's the kicker. For a huge chunk of Scotus's work, this flawed edition is still the best we have. So yes, you have to use it, but you absolutely must treat it with extreme caution. It's like navigating an old, slightly damaged map. It gets you in the ballpark, but you need to be careful where you step. This SCOTUS example isn't just an isolated incident. It highlights a fundamental challenge in studying medieval philosophy. There's always a gap between what the original thinker actually wrote or said, and what we end up reading in a modern printed edition, let alone a translation. We're talking about a journey from authentic words through Latin manuscripts, potentially through early printed editions, and finally into English. Each step can introduce changes, omissions, or additions. The goal here isn't to scare you off. It's not meant to dismay prospective students. Instead, it's about making you aware of these potential pitfalls. By understanding the nature and size of this gap, you can equip yourselves with the right tools and strategies to navigate these challenges effectively. Think of it as learning the rules of the road before embarking on a complex journey. So, how did these texts travel through time? Ideally, we'd love to have the autograph, the author's own handwriting. Imagine having Aquinas' original notes. But spoiler alert, these ideal cases are incredibly rare. Even when we do find autographs, like Aquinas', they come with their own headaches. He was apparently prone to typos, absent-mindedly writing the wrong word. And his handwriting? Forget about it. Only a tiny handful of specialists can actually read it. So autographs are out, mostly. What are we left with? Texts passed down through intermediaries. This ranges from copies the author himself checked, which is pretty good, to things that are basically distant cousins of someone's lecture notes, copied by scribes who might not have been following the discussion perfectly. Especially when philosophy was taught orally, through lectures and public debates, the number of hands touching a text could be enormous. Think about it. More people involved means more chances for errors to creep in, or for the text to get corrupted along the way. The potential for things going sideways is significant. Let's zoom in on those oral traditions. Philosophy wasn't just written down, it was performed. Lectures, formal disputations, think academic debates, but with more yelling and less PowerPoint. Now, right from the start, a single lecture could spawn multiple versions. You had the master dictating directly, and then you had the students taking notes, their reportations. And get this, a university statute from Paris in 1355 literally told masters to speak fast, so that the mind can take them in, but the hand cannot keep up, it says. Basically, talk so fast the students can barely write it down. What does that tell you? It screams potential problems with the student notes. Omissions, sure. Mistranscriptions, definitely. Misunderstandings, absolutely. And then, other students would copy these already potentially flawed reports, multiplying the number of competing versions. Disputations were even worse, usually more chaotic, and sometimes the report included the master's final ruling, sometimes it didn't. It's like trying to reconstruct a complex argument from half-remembered fragments and slightly garbled transcripts. Okay, so if a master wanted a more polished version, they'd create an ordinatio. This was like the official, revised text. They'd take their own notes or a student's report and refine it, maybe add new material, correct some errors. Then, they'd submit it to the university's official booksellers, the stationery for distribution. Think of this as the medieval equivalent of publishing. But here's the rub. Creating an ordinatio wasn't always about preserving the original lecture perfectly. Masters might update it, reflecting new thoughts developed since giving the lectures. Or they might decide the original lectures had their own literary integrity and stick close to them. Either way, new errors could be introduced, especially if revisions weren't consistent throughout. And then came the distribution. These ordinatios weren't printed books initially. They circulated in units called PCA, unbound sets of pages, usually 16. Imagine getting a chapter here, a section there, from different sources. A copyist might grab a PCA from source A and another from source B, mixing potentially different versions of the same text. Plus, these PCI themselves weren't stable. They'd wear out, people would add notes, maybe even change things to make the doctrine seem more acceptable. It's a recipe for textual complexity. And who were these copyists? Well, they weren't always perfect scholars. Sometimes, they just weren't philosophically sophisticated enough to grasp the nuances of the text. Other times, they were paid by the piece. Faster meant more money, so accuracy took a back seat. Some copyists were only interested in copying the bits they found useful, ignoring the rest. Others just got tired. And then you have quotes like the one from Anneliese Meyer about a disgruntled copyist refusing to copy a whole page of totally useless material from Walter Burley. It shows the sheer drudgery involved. Despite all these potential sources of error, poor understanding, speed pressure, fatigue, selective copying, these manuscripts are invaluable. For many texts, they are our only source. And even when we have later, supposedly better editions, the manuscripts are often the key resource for spotting and correcting errors in those editions. So while they are fraught with peril, manuscripts are also our lifeline to the past. So, how do we deal with this messy reality? How do we try to recover the original text? We need specialized skills, acting like detectives of the textual world. First up is paleography, the study of writing. This means learning to recognize different handwriting styles, but more importantly, mastering the complex system of abbreviation scribes used to save space and materials. Think of it like learning the secret code of medieval scribes. Good news, you don't need to become a paleographical expert overnight. A basic competence is surprisingly accessible and incredibly helpful. Then there's codicology, the study of the physical books themselves, the manuscripts. Looking at the binding, the layout, the marginalia can sometimes give clues about how a text was copied and transmitted. Finally, text editing. This is the art and science of assessing which manuscripts are most reliable, figuring out which ones are related, manuscript families, and then using established principles to reconstruct the best possible version of the original text. It's like piecing together a shattered vase from various fragments, trying to determine which pieces belong together and which might be fakes or additions. After the manuscript stage comes the next big leap, the early printed edition. Now, these weren't always scholarly masterpieces. Often they were produced quickly, sometimes using late or even dubious manuscripts. However, they are crucial because they represent the first mass production of these texts. For some works, they might be our only printed source. And if the manuscripts used to print them are lost, these early prints become an independent witness, something we can compare against surviving manuscripts. Then we reach the modern critical editions. These are the gold standard. Editors gather all the available manuscript evidence, including relevant early prints, analyze the relationships between manuscripts, form hypotheses about how the text evolved, and then reconstruct the original text according to rigorous textual scholarship principles. But even here, perfection is elusive. Sometimes, an editor has to make a judgment call based on which reading makes the most philosophical sense, and that judgment can be debated. Also, remember that punctuation in manuscripts is often non-existent or minimal. So the punctuation in critical editions is almost entirely editorial. And guess what? Even in supposedly critical editions, you can find misleading punctuation that drastically changes the meaning. The best advice? Treat the punctuation with a healthy dose of skepticism. Let's hammer home this point about punctuation. Medieval manuscripts often used what we might call the random dot method. Punctuation was sparse, sometimes just a dot or a line, and it rarely helped you understand the sentence structure or the flow of the argument. So when editors create critical editions, they have to add all the punctuation, sentence breaks, paragraph divisions, etc. This is almost entirely their decision. And here's the danger: even experienced editors can make mistakes. A misplaced comma or a period can completely alter the meaning of a sentence, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. Think about how much ambiguity punctuation can introduce in English. Now imagine doing that for dense technical Latin based on minimal clues. It's a high-stakes game. The safest advice, therefore, is to largely ignore the punctuation provided in critical editions. Focus on the words and the structure of the Latin itself. Your own reading of the Latin will often guide you better than the editor's punctuation choices. Theory is great, but let's look at some real-world examples. To really grasp the varied fates of medieval texts, we'll examine 3 case studies: Anselm of Canterbury, John Duns Scotus, and Robert Holcott. Why these 3? Because they represent different scenarios in terms of textual reliability. The aim here is twofold. First, to give you concrete examples of the kinds of problems we've discussed, the things to watch out for when diving into a philosopher's work. Second, to show just how much work is still needed in textual and editorial studies in medieval philosophy. We're not talking about dusty archives. There's exciting, foundational work left to do. We've chosen thinkers whose texts range from relatively well-preserved to exceptionally challenging. First up, Anselm. Compared to some, Anselm's textual history is remarkably straightforward. Why? Because much of his work started life as written compositions, not just lecture notes. We even have a manuscript Bodleian 271 whose scribe we know was a Canterbury monk who corresponded with Anselm about textual details. Anselm himself seems to have been quite meticulous about revising his work. He did complain about people copying his dialogues out of order, showing he cared about the text's integrity. Interestingly, the chapter headings in his works like Proslogion were actually added by him, though he put them all at the beginning, unlike later scribes who might repeat them. Now the early printed editions? Not so great. The first one in 1491 by Dannhauser used late manuscripts and seems to have had a humanist bent, trying to improve the text. Many later editions just followed him uncritically. Things improved significantly with Gabriel Gerberon's 1675 edition, but it still missed some key manuscripts. The real breakthrough came with F.S. Schmidt's edition in 1968. This was a monumental effort, collating numerous manuscripts and largely correcting the received text. Today, Schmidt's edition is considered the benchmark for Anselm's Latin. For studying Anselm, you can, to a remarkable degree, simply assume the reliability of the Latin text in Schmidt's edition. It's a rare gift. Now let's swing to the other end of the spectrum, John Duns Scotus. As we hinted earlier, his textual transmission is famously complicated. Let's look at just one part, his Ordinatio, the revised version of his Oxford Lectures. This Ordinatio wasn't a single clean sweep. It shows clear signs of multiple revision layers. There was an initial revision started around 1300, but Scotus left Oxford for Paris in 1302, leaving it incomplete. Later, while in Paris, he continued revising it, adding updates reflecting what he was teaching there, often as marginal notes or inserted passages. The problem is our picture of this second layer of revision is still murky. The Vatican edition, which is the main one published so far, only goes up to Book 2, and there's no critical edition of the Paris Reportatio, which contains crucial material. Alan B. Walter argues forcefully that we shouldn't treat the Ordinatio as a single, unified work representing Scotus's final views. It's more like a project started in Oxford, left unfinished, and then patched up with Paris material. Walter suggests Book 9 of the Ordinatio reflects his early views and needs to be supplemented with material from his later Cambridge and Paris lectures, much of which hasn't been edited. So, for serious Scotus study, you need paleographical skills to read those unedited reports and the remaining Ordinatio parts, and text editing skills to weigh the different manuscript readings. It's a demanding task. Our third case study is Robert Holcott, an Oxford Dominican, whose importance has been seriously underestimated. Despite this, he was hugely influential in the late Middle Ages, as evidenced by the sheer number of manuscripts copied of his works, dozens of sentences commentaries, an astonishing 175 manuscripts of his commentary on wisdom. He made significant contributions to semantics, theology, and philosophy. Let's focus on his sentences questions. Evidence strongly suggests the Pitia system was key to how they spread. Manuscripts show signs of this out-of-order copying. Worse, substantial text seems to have been lost in transmission. In some early manuscripts, whole counter-arguments are missing. A later manuscript print from 1497 acknowledges the text was in a disorderly state, and the reviewer couldn't establish a reliable text. And guess what? That 1497 edition is the only printed version available today. No complete collation of the manuscripts has been done, and no critical edition is currently planned. So Holcott presents a fantastic opportunity, a rich philosophical thinker, whose texts are crying out for careful textual and philosophical study. It's a field ripe for exploration. All right, we've navigated the treacherous waters of manuscripts and early prints. But for most of us who aren't specialists in Latin paleography, the final step is translation. Getting medieval philosophy into English is obviously crucial for wider access and for training specialists. Think about Alan Wolter's translations of Scotus. Countless people got introduced to Scotus through his work. It's a virtuous cycle. Translations encourage study, and studies encourage more translations. Given that, how can we use these translations wisely? Knowing even a little Latin is incredibly helpful. Especially for texts from the 13th and 14th centuries, the Latin syntax is generally simpler, and the vocabulary is often quite limited, mostly technical terms. This means you can often spot suspicious passages in a translation and quickly check the original Latin to get back on track. It's like having a safety net. Sometimes, you can even detect a faulty translation without knowing Latin. Consider this passage from a popular translation of Anselm's Proslogion. Anselm is discussing how we misuse language, using to be for not to be, and to do for not to do, or to do nothing. He gives an example. Again we say, this man is sitting, just as we say that man is doing something. Or we say this man is resting, just as we say that man is doing something. But to sit is not to do something, and to rest is to do nothing. Hold on. Does that make sense? The sentence structure is awkward, and it doesn't actually provide the promised example of to do meaning not to do or to do nothing, in the same way as the previous example. By paying close attention to the philosophical argument, we can tell something is wrong with the translation, even without seeing the Latin. A quick look reveals the Latin allows for a much clearer rendering that fits the argument perfectly. Similar issues arise when translators attach modifiers, like adverbs, to the wrong part of the sentence. Again, philosophical attention can flag these errors, even if pinpointing the exact fix requires Latin. But what about translations that seem okay, but subtly reflect the translator's own interpretation of the text? Look at these two alternative translations of a passage from Scotus on God's justice. Both make grammatical sense in English. But notice the differences. Translator A says God is a debtor to his generosity. Translator B says God is a debtor in virtue of his generosity. Why the difference? Because these translators have different philosophical takes on Scotus. Translator A's phrasing supports his view that Scotus believed God's justice to creatures is ultimately a matter of God's justice to himself, driven by his generosity. Translator B's phrasing, however, aligns with his interpretation of Scotus as an extreme voluntarist, where God's will is the sole determinant of justice. The choice of words isn't neutral. It embeds the translator's philosophical stance right into the translation. It's a powerful reminder that translation isn't just linguistic conversion, it's interpretation. So, if philosophical vigilance isn't enough to catch every error, how do we judge a translator's reliability? Asking senior medievalists for recommendations can be helpful, but proceed with caution. Translators, perhaps temperamentally, might be inclined to criticize the work of others. A better approach is to form your own judgment by reading a selection of the translator's other academic work. Does the translator write clearly and accurately in their own articles? A sloppy thinker tends to produce sloppy translations. An unreliable interpreter tends to produce unreliable translations. Even the translator's prose style can offer clues. Someone who consistently writes hazily in English is likely to produce hazy translations. Conversely, someone who writes with precision is likely to translate with precision. Elegant prose is nice, but it doesn't always guarantee philosophical fidelity. Elegance can sometimes be a temptation to stray from strict faithfulness to the text. Now, let's talk about specific words, the pairs and snares of translation. One common trap is lazy cognates, just picking the English word that sounds similar to the Latin. Take malitia, often translated as malice, implying a desire to harm. But more often, it just means badness, the opposite of goodness. Similarly, officiosum, often rendered as officious, meaning meddlesome. But in the context of lies, a mendacium officiosum is a serviceable lie, not a meddlesome one. The correct translation comes from understanding Latin word formation. Malicia from malum bad, so badness. Officiosum from officium function or service, so functional or serviceable. Paying attention to these patterns helps avoid such mistakes. For many other words, there's simply no perfect English equivalent. Appetitus, for instance, gets translated as appetite, understood as a technical term. Potentia becomes potency or potentiality, actus becomes act or actuality, and accidents becomes accident. These are conventions, but they're widely recognized by anyone familiar with medieval texts, so they're generally not misleading. But then there are the really tricky words, the protean terms that shift shape depending on context. Is a word like honestum describing a single, consistent property like intrinsic value, or is it a more general term of commendation whose meaning shifts with each occurrence? The answer affects whether a consistent translation is possible or even desirable. And don't forget, just because a word is technical for one author doesn't mean it's technical for another. Even the same author might use the same word both technically and non-technically within the same work. Terms like principium and ratio are notorious examples. Principium can mean beginning, origin, premise, principle, starting point. The list goes on. Ratio can mean argument, basis, concept, definition, essential nature, feature, ground, intelligible nature, meaning, model, reason, theoretical account. You get the idea. Translating these requires more than just knowing Latin. It demands exegetical skill and philosophical acuity to determine how the word is being used in that specific context and translate accordingly. It's a high-level interpretive challenge. So, we've walked through the potential minefields, the messy manuscripts, the flawed early prints, the interpretive translations, the tricky vocabulary. It sounds like a lot of drudgery, doesn't it? Well, maybe a little. But it's also incredibly rewarding. As Catherine Tecco likes to say, doing paleography is like being paid to do crossword puzzles. If you enjoy detective stories, you'll love codicological research and text editing. It's all about picking up clues and drawing inferences. And if you take pleasure in finding the precise words to express a difficult thought, translation offers deep satisfaction. Above all, the effort to recover the authentic words of these medieval philosophers is worthwhile, because those words are philosophically fascinating. There's still an astonishing amount of first-rate, inventive, and profound thought waiting to be rediscovered. The effort required to make these texts accessible is amply repaid by the chance to reclaim treasures from a rich intellectual heritage. It's a challenging but deeply fulfilling endeavor.